Good afternoon, all. I wanted to take a little time to talk you through a paper that I wrote up this morning, as I felt that it might be helpful for you to look at an actual example of the final paper. I'm going to do a two-part series, I think, because it would be the most helpful. So this is part one. Part two will deal specifically with finding research and addressing some of the common errors that I saw on some of your papers. So first and foremost, I want to draw your attention to how this paper is set up. For MLA formatting, most of you had this correct, but make sure that you have your name, then my name, then the course, then the date. Title goes here above your first body paragraph. Notice that I'm using the title and subtitle that I asked you guys to use or practice at the beginning of the semester. And then I've got my header up here that demonstrates my last name and the page number. All right, so the title of my paper, Listless in a Pandemic, the Hollow Men as Registration of Collective Inactivity. Notice from this very first title that you get a general sense of what I'm going to be discussing in my paper. About listlessness. I'm going to be talking about a pandemic. I'm going to be talking specifically about The Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot, which is a poem that we covered. And I'm going to be talking about this idea of sort of collective inactivity. So I start my introduction with a general intro to some of the ideas that I will be touching on in this paper. So languidly moving from room to room, trapped like a caged animal, waking each morning with the hope for release, such a description captures the sensation of living in a world in the grips of a pandemic. Each person feels a static thing, often silent and always sequestered, an object suspended in time, waiting. So notice that's very general. I haven't talked at all about specifics that I'm going to be covering in this paper, but I'm at least sort of getting your interest. I'm hooking you in. We want to know more. We're getting like this general description of being inactive, held captive, this listlessness. Then I get into specifics. Indeed, the work of T.S. Eliot captures the sensation well when he writes in The Hollow Men that characters are, quote, shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. Then I move to what I will specifically discuss in this paper. Throughout The Hollow Men, readers encounter a tone of desperation, longing, and stasis, images of hollow men, stuffed men, waiting and watching. While they watch and wait, the world passes by them, and they are relegated to what Eliot calls death's other kingdom, which is one of interminable waiting. One of the main themes of Eliot's The Hollow Men is desperation, and such a theme attaches to the sensation inherent in sequestering regulations and quarantine mandates visited on populaces who have experienced pandemics like the current one. So notice that I'm specifically attaching T.S. Eliot's The Hollow Men to what I set up in the beginning part of this introduction. This was something that a lot of folks struggled with in the rough draft, was that your introductory material up here that's supposed to draw your reader in did not at all attach to what you were planning to discuss in the body of your paper. You need to make sure that what you set up here primes your reader for what you're planning to discuss in the deeper parts of your paper. Notice too that I'm already pointing to something that will be of key import to the argument to come, specifically this theme of desperation. So then I get into a thesis statement, a specific and focused phrase, one sentence that captures everything that I'm going to cover in my paper. So through his choice of language and imagery, Eliot communicates the same desperation that is palpable in the current COVID-19 situation, and which has been observed in similar situations such as the bubonic plague. To help highlight some of the important things that I want you to keep in mind, I have highlighted the main ideas that I'm planning to cover in my paper and have also noted the theme that I am planning to focus on. Jointly, I have also given the reader some idea of some of the material that I will point to in my body paragraphs. Your thesis statement, remember, should have two things. It should have your main argument. That's my main argument right there. Eliot communicates the same desperation that is palpable in the current COVID-19 situation and which has been observed in similar situations such as the bubonic plague. And part 2 has to highlight for the reader how you are going to show that. I'm going to show that Eliot communicates desperation specifically through his choice of language and imagery. If I don't point to how I see that happening, my reader has no idea how to follow along with my argument. So again, part 1, I'm arguing that Eliot communicates desperation, and I'm going to demonstrate that he shows desperation specifically through his choice of language and imagery. The final phrase of this introduction transitions into the first body paragraph and gives the reader a heads up about what they are going to encounter there. So through his language specifically, Eliot attends to the visceral feelings and sensations of being trapped and relegated to inactivity, which in turn causes a sense of desperation and longing for a time before. So notice that I point specifically to the fact that I'm going to discuss language in that first body paragraph. Moving on to the first body paragraph, and this is what I sketched out for you guys. I have highlighted key phrases to demonstrate how you thread an argument through a first body paragraph. Because again, this was something that I noticed in a lot of your papers throughout the semester, but specifically for this final paper. So I start with a transitional phrase. So throughout the Hollow Men, Eliot chooses words and phrases that capture the notion of suspended animation, something akin to the experiences of those in a state of isolation and quarantine, and which contribute to an overwhelming feeling of desperation. What I want to draw your attention to are these two phrases that I've highlighted for you. Notice that my transitional phrase, first part, attaches to part 1 of my thesis statement. I've organized for the reader so that he or she can see that the first thing I'm going to deal with is this notion of language choice. Secondly, I have also repeated the main argument that I'm venturing, which is this notion of desperation. You have to point to both of these things throughout this body paragraph. Otherwise, the reader is not quite sure what you're discussing. We call these logical bridges in writing. So before I even read this out to you, notice that you see the term desperation repeated several times throughout this body paragraph. That way, the reader is clear that this entire paragraph, though it is focused on words and phrases in the Hollow Men, is showing this idea of desperation, which is my overarching argument. So let me read through this for you. Throughout the Hollow Men, Eliot chooses words and phrases that capture the notion of suspended animation, something akin to the experiences of those in a state of isolation and quarantine, and which contribute to an overwhelming feeling of desperation. Words like quiet, meaningless, death, solemn, fading, waking alone, etc., conjure a tone of desperation and silent, lonely suffering, creating for the reader a sensation similar to what has been observed of other pandemics like COVID-19. In the fictitious representation of the plague, in Albert Camus' The Plague, Camus describes the experience of the populace as, quote, thus in a middle course between these heights and depths, they drifted through life rather than lived, the prey of aimless days and sterile memories, like wandering shadows that could have acquired substance only by consenting to root themselves in the solid earth of their distress. Using words like drifted, aimless, sterile, wandering, and distress are similar to the terms used by Eliot when he is describing desperation in the poem. While reading, happening upon words such as these manipulate the reading experience so that the reader is, in turn, internalizing the same sensations as are clear in the written piece. Readers begin to plunge deeper into a similar despair and recognize within themselves the capacity for hopelessness and desperation that are articulated in fictitious spaces. So much of the narrative concerning COVID-19 has demonstrated a similar language to describe the experience for many across the world. A survey of current news headlines include terms like death toll, mutation, crisis, fear, and fatigue, fuels the continued feeling of desperation inherent in the current period. Eliot clearly captures the experiences of those quarantined, past and present, and helps to give voice to the human experience of isolation and uncertainty. So what I've highlighted here, a couple of things that I want you guys to keep in mind. So notice this first phrase before I get into my quotation. This is called an introductory phrase. You need to introduce all quotations to demonstrate not only what they mean and where they came from, but to situate them in the body of your paper. So in the fictitious representation of the plague, in Albert Camus' The Plague, Camus describes the experiences of the populace as, and then we get the quotation. The next phrases after that, I have at least 2 to 4 sentences that specifically discuss not only this quotation, but also their attachment to Eliot's The Hollow Men. Notice, in fact, that I've highlighted this phrase, that I specifically connect this quotation to the terms used by Eliot in The Hollow Men. By the end of this paragraph, I also turn my attention to the current pandemic and how the same words that we're seeing in the news also attach to what Eliot is discussing in The Hollow Men. I then begin the second body paragraph, at least so that you can see a new phrase, a new transitional phrase. So Eliot also leans on specific imagery that contributes to an overarching reading of desperation, one that is attached to an assessment of the current COVID-19 pandemic. So notice that I am talking specifically about imagery in this body paragraph, which if I go back to my thesis statement, I have highlighted here for you. Body paragraph 1 is on language. Body paragraph 2 is on imagery. I have organized it for myself in such a way that I point to these 2 specific parts of the poem to help venture my argument about this feeling of desperation. I would take the same pattern that I have in the first body paragraph and recreate it here for the second body paragraph. I want to draw your attention to the works cited page that I've created here for just the 2 pieces that I used. I saw a couple different iterations of works cited pages. Very few of them were exactly how MLA specifies. Make sure that you have titled your work Works Cited, that's it, centered on the page. Each entry is alphabetically ordered based on the author last name, and make sure that you have the author last name, first name, title of the piece, maybe the container on which you located it, the city in which it was published, the publishing company, and the date on which it was published. I've given you here a book, and then I also have a piece that was located on a website. For help with MLA formatting, please see Purdue OWL. If you do a Google search, you can easily locate it and look specifically for MLA citation and formatting guide. That's all for this particular piece. I will be back with a tutorial on the research and answering some of the assignment